Earlier, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation said it condemned Israel's violation of the Geneva Conventions, looking specifically at a convention saying that people should not be starved. That cannot be used as a war tool, not a method. Let's look at the conflict now through the lens of international law. We're joined by advocate Michael Osborne. Michael, thank you for being with us. Let's start with that. I mean, since Wednesday, Israel has cut off food, power, water supplies. The South African government says that is a clear violation of international law. Do you believe Israel is already guilty of war crimes, as that statement suggests?
Good afternoon, Francis. Prima facie, I think there's a good argument that would constitute a war crime. The relevant provision of the Geneva Convention additional protocol speaks in terms of starvation or an attempt to bring about starvation. That's what's really required. A blockade in and of itself might not be a war crime. So one would need to look at the relevant facts. But prima facie, a case does seem to have been made, because one of the things being cut off, as you mentioned, is food.
Yeah, and we've heard the same rhetoric from a Labour leader in Britain. What about the other conventions around civilians? So the UN saying yesterday that it would be impossible for all the innocent civilians in the north of Gaza to move south in 24 hours. That was the initial deadline. It was then extended for 6 hours. So surely there will be analysis on whether the warnings were enough.
Yes, that's certainly a major concern. First of all, the forced or compelled displacement of civilians from their homes, in this case numbering 1.5 million, I believe. First of all, that's a crime against humanitarian law. But secondly, the reason I suspect Israel is doing this is because, so they would say, they don't want there to be massive civilian casualties in the course of Israel bombing military targets, Hamas. So, and all of that you must look at against the background of the Geneva Convention, which says that, or it recognizes that there may be incidental civilian casualties. However, the obligation is upon the attacking party, in this case Israel, to act proportionately and take all possible steps to minimize civilian casualties. So this is obviously the thinking that's behind Israel's relocation demand.
What do you think of the argument that many of these people can't move, so it won't be incidental? There are even claims that Hamas is preventing people from going. Tens of thousands, of course, have fled. But the ambassador in London saying, well, essentially they have nowhere to go. They can go south. The conditions are dire. It's not like there are many options here. Does that play a part?
Yes, it certainly does play a part. If you make an unreasonable demand that 1.5 million people move in a tiny 25-kilometer long strip out of their houses, that will reduce the force in international law of Israel's argument that it's taken all reasonable steps. I should say there's another side to the story, and this would be a criticism of international relations statement of yesterday. The other side to the argument is that it's in itself a war crime to use civilians as human shields. So just as Israel should be minimizing the number of civilian casualties, by the same token, Hamas should not be setting up its military in civilian areas.
Is there not a difference, though? Hamas, brutally targeted and slaughtered civilians. In its response, however, does Israel not have a higher burden to bear, I guess, because it is a nation state and it's subject to international law?
Well, the Palestinians are also subject to international law. They've in fact signed on in 2015 to the Geneva Convention, I'm sorry. So they too are bound, and they too, prima facie, appear to have violated the principle that you cannot kidnap civilians. And secondly, they may be accused, possibly credibly, of using their own civilians as human shields by, for example, putting anti-aircraft guns on tops of residential blocks of flats. So this is not entirely, or it's not at all an entirely one-sided matter. And that's what I think is unfortunate about the statement we saw from international relations yesterday.
So you would have preferred something that looks at protecting civilians on both sides. I mean, Michael, before you go, essentially, if the world is aghast at the tactics of both Hamas and Israel, or one or the other, what can actually happen afterwards? Could it be argued that international law means nothing when it's so easily broken in various parts of the world?
Yes. International law has conspicuously been broken, largely by Russia and Ukraine. There are no consequences, apart from an ICC indictment of President Putin, which will probably never be enforced. So all of this does make something of a mockery of international law. And it supports the cynicism of people who say that international law means nothing. That being said, the fight behind the fight, so to speak, here, is the attempt to win international public opinion. If you can demonstrate that your opponent is clearly violating international law, you can take it to the court of public opinion, and you may well win a degree of support. So that's what this is all about. It's not really about the prospect of any particular court taking any particular action.
If the final question, if the ICC does make any moves in future accusing either party of war crimes, I guess that would be a test of the fairness and the position of the ICC to act with so many divisions in a fair manner.
Yes, it would be. And in fact, the ICC in 2020 already said there's prima facie proof of war crimes committed both by Israel and by Hamas. That investigation so far seems to have gone nowhere. But the reality is, with Israel having such firm support from the United States, it's hard to imagine that an Israeli prime minister or president will ever be arrested and taken to The Hague. That's just realism.
All right. We appreciate that analysis. Law expert advocate Michael Osborne. Let's take a short break. We'll be back with more on The Full View. Great to have you with us.